Good morning, Boker Tov. It's a great honor to be here today. In the paper that follows, what I say may be true of other books of the Jewish canon, but Isaiah is a big enough book and an important enough book that that's going to be plenty for 20 minutes, and I still won't cover everything by any stretch of the imagination. But interest in the text and the various text forms of the book of Isaiah is intimately connected with the self-understanding of various Jewish and then Christian communities from the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era onwards, and most especially in the century before and the century after the turn of the era. I think most of us are very familiar with the phenomenon of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but for anybody who doesn't quite remember the background to the discovery, the initial discoveries, it's worth reading the succinct but fairly comprehensive coverage in the DJD volume 32 by Eugene Ulrich and Peter Flint, and that came out in 2010. And it recounts the extraordinary events of the finding of the first scrolls from Cave 1 in 1947. It did take its discoverers, its purchasers, and scholars generally, it took them a very long time to accept that the great Isaiah scroll, 1Q Isaiah A as we know it now, was not medieval or later. Some people thought at the time it was only 200 years old, because they'd never seen anything that was 2,000 years old in this detail. The Nash Papyrus was a similar age, but from Egypt, and very short. So once people had got over this mental block, as it were, I mean, why would we expect something to be quite so antique? It was really quite revolutionary. But of course, at the same time, there were really momentous historical and political events going on at the same time, the military too, and this massively complicated the issue of the provenance of the scrolls, who could study them, who could own them, and so on. But from about 1Q Isaiah A was studied from the early 50s onwards. It was photographed even before that. And from 1965, it was, of course, on display in the Shrine of the Book. From the point of view of biblical scholarship, so most of us here today have grown up with knowledge of that important find. And as an undergraduate studying Hebrew, I acquired my first copy of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia in 1981. And in that volume, the text of Isaiah, which I used to take to classes with Professor James Barr back in the 1980s, the critical text was the work of Winton Thomas, published originally in 1968. So for me and for people of my generation and before, the study of Isaiah in any ancient language had 1Q Isaiah A firmly in the background, even if it was rather relegated to the apparatus at the bottom of the page. But when we look back to what the previous generation had thought about the book, it's really quite amazing they had to work with so much less information. So somebody as prominent as G.B. Gray could only make very speculative statements about the growth and content of the book of Isaiah, as it was then known. In 1912, he gave his opinion that, I quote, "The book of Isaiah in its present form and extent existed at latest by the end of the 1st century AD. I mean, that's to us astonishing, but he was going on what facts he had at his disposal. He did go on to say, a book of Isaiah having certain of the most conspicuous features of the present book, if not the present book itself, existed about 180 BC, which is a bit closer to what we now know. 45 years after that statement of Gray's, the paleographical evidence of 1Q Isaiah A had taken this range back to the Hasmonean period for the form of the book as a whole, for the copy that we have. In other words, the 66 chapters of the entire book, and in that present order, had existed in authoritative form long enough to be copied into what we call the Great Isaiah Scroll by about 125 of the before the Common Era. Now, there are certainly many hundreds of small variants from the Masoretic text in the Great Isaiah Scroll. But apart from a couple of missing or a couple of extra verses, these involve pretty minor details, just lots of them. So we don't have evidence for an alternative literary edition of Isaiah from Qumran, as we do from some other books of scripture like Jeremiah and possibly Exodus. But clearly Isaiah was a very popular book at Qumran, given the number of copies of the biblical text that were found there, and there are 6 pesharim on it as well. I'd like to have had time to talk about those, but it's too limited. Scholars such as Jean Ulrich, George Brooke and Joseph Blenkinsop have drawn parallels between the importance of Isaiah at Qumran and the frequency of Isaianic citations in the New Testament. Was this interest in the book confined to the Qumran community and the early Christian movement, or was it shared much more widely between different Jewish groups in the Second Temple period? We don't know, we just go on the evidence we have. But of course the book of Isaiah was not known only through its Hebrew form at the time of Qumran and the New Testament. The book had already been translated into Greek by Jews in Alexandria in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. So even before the Isaiah scroll was written, there was in existence an old Greek form of it. Often people refer to it as the Septuagint of Isaiah, but for the purposes of this paper I want to talk really about the earliest possible translation, which technically should be referred to as the OG or the Old Greek. Jean Ulrich has pointed out that 1Q Isaiah A, I quote, presents an image much more realistic than that provided by the Masoretic text, which of course is a medieval rabbinic text, of the type of scroll from which the translator of the Septuagint must have worked, and of the difficulties involved in understanding the text to be translated, end quote. This observation is helpful because the nature of the Old Greek Isaiah is notoriously difficult to explain. It lurches from literal to paraphrastic within a few verses, and sometimes presents what appears to be a very different understanding of the Hebrew from what we would say the Hebrew meant. Though 1Q Isaiah A does sometimes line up with the Old Greek against the Masoretic text and against other Qumran texts of Isaiah, it is not, I have to emphasize, it's not closely related to the Greek version, just very occasionally. Now, the Hebrew texts underlying the Old Greek Isaiah must have been even older than 1Q Isaiah A, and probably differed even further from it and from the Masoretic text of the rabbis. Such a scroll was presumably brought to Alexandria no later than the early 2nd century BCE. By about 150 BCE, it had been translated for use among the Jewish community there in Egypt. Now, the rather enigmatic references in some chapters of the Old Greek Isaiah have allowed some scholars to interpret them as a conscious updating of the meaning of the Hebrew by the Greek translator, in order to apply it to his own Jewish Greek community in Alexandria. Now, this feature is usually termed actualization or sometimes contemporization. The pioneer of this approach was Isaac Seligman, the Dutch Jewish scholar, who published his remarkable monograph on Septuagint Isaiah in 1948, which of course was the very year of the discovery of the Great Isaiah Scroll. And in fact, Seligman made marginal notes in his own copy of his own book regarding some of the readings from 1Q Isaiah, where it sort of justified what he'd been discussing before the scroll was discovered. And those notes are now in the 2004 re-edition of Seligman's work. Others took his approach still further. For instance, Arie van der Kooi, the Dutch scholar, thinks that the rendering of Tarshish in chapter 23 as Karkedon in Greek, it's the Greek name from Carthage, he thinks this rendering alludes to the fall of Carthage in 146 BCE. Van der Kooi argues that the translator was trying to consciously update the original Hebrew prophecy in that chapter to his own time, but clearly almost eradicating the original meaning of the Hebrew, even if he'd known what it was. Other people have also argued for a fairly clear messianic message throughout the book. Others have reacted against that and said, no, it's much less well-defined than that. So really, we're not too sure that there are really there's a very wide spectrum of opinion on Old Greek Isaiah and what it was trying to do, what the translator was trying to do. and the jury is still out. Alternative, more mundane explanations for the Old Greek's differences against the Hebrew are also possible. Some of the variation can be attributed to poor legibility of the Hebrew scroll that the translator was working from, or different ways, legitimate ways, of interpreting the Hebrew consonantal text, or possibly a special translation technique that the translator wanted to use. He may not have been consciously changing the meaning of the Hebrew text at all. That may have been how his community understood it, how he thought the consonantal letters actually, it was a legitimate meaning that he could see there. Be that as it may, the very uncertainty among modern scholars about why Old Greek Isaiah looks the way it does illustrates the elusive nature of the translation. Much as the Hebrew original itself, its meaning is often open to a variety of interpretations, both now and then. So the idea of preparing the way of the Lord was adopted as a motif both by the Qumran community on the basis of the Hebrew and by the Gospel writers, but mainly from the Greek tradition. So the Hebrew text of Isaiah 43, Kol Koreh Bamidbar Panu Derech Hashem, was understood by the Qumran sect as a voice calls out, quote, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord." And this links to the community's separation from the congregation of the men of falsehood and their retreat into the wilderness in order to study the Torah there. But in the Gospels, the very same text was taken in the sense of the Old Greek translation, a voice of someone shouting in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." And so it's referred to John the Baptist's desert ministry heralding a national religious revival. Undeniably, it was the Greek version of Isaiah rather than Hebrew Isaiah that exerted the major, but not the only, influence on St. Paul. Some scholars argue that Paul was able to exploit the different wording of the Greek version in order to universalize the prophet's message to include non-Jews as well as Jews. Yet the Old Greek and the emerging Masoretic texts weren't, apparently, the only text available in the first century of the Common Era. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 54, the citation of Isaiah 25:8 is actually much closer to the version that we call Theodotion than to either the Old Greek or to the vocalized Masoretic text. It is, what Paul quotes is, "Death has been swallowed up in victory," whereas the Old Greek has the words, "Having prevailed, death swallowed them up," which is a rather negative view of what's happening in that passage, and it wouldn't fit Paul's argument at all. Even the Masoretic text has God has swallowed up death forever, which is fine, but it hasn't got that sort of note of victory that the Theodotion quote has. This type of example gives rise to a debate over how far St. Paul deliberately selected particular forms of scriptural text for his argument. Some scholars argue that it wasn't due so much to intention on Paul's part, there were just a lot of different Greek text forms circulating at that time. Whatever Paul's own working methods, we do have concrete proof that Hebraizing revisions of the Old Greek were circulating in the first century of the Common Era. This is thanks to another important find from the Dead Sea area, not Qumran this time, but Nachal Hever, and the insights of another great scholar, Dominique Barthélemy. This Nachal Hever scroll was connected to the Bar Kokhba revolt, and it contained fragments from a text of the Minor Prophets in Greek, not Isaiah, but Minor Prophets. However, Barthélemy showed that this scroll did not reflect the Old Greek form of the Minor Prophets, but a revision towards the Masoretic text of the 12, the emerging Masoretic text. Barthélemy also made connections with similar translational features in other Greek scriptural texts, and he produced the theory that a widespread revisional movement in Greek that he called Kai was at work in this period, and it formed the basis for the more literal renderings of Aquila in around 130 of the Common Era. This was a big fashion in the 60s and 70s following his work. People got very excited, and some rather exaggerated theories were developed on the basis of this. I think perhaps we've gone too far in the other direction now, and we don't talk enough about the importance of this revisional stage. So some studies of nuance Barthelemy this picture considerably, particularly his idea that it was the early rabbis who were promoting this revision of Greek scripture in an attempt to reflect small textual details for exegetical purposes, including Rabbi Akiva. Since Peter Parsons and other paleographers have dated the manuscript hand of the Greek Minor Prophet scroll to the end of the 1st century before the Common Era, the movement to revise Old Greek texts in a more literal direction must already have been taking place well before Christians and rabbis could take an interest in what the Greek text was saying. Though the hard evidence for these early revisions comes from the scroll of the 12, it is very likely indeed that the Old Greek of Isaiah was undergoing some revision in this same period, particularly given the fact that it was very different from the emerging Hebrew text. Thus, it would not be surprising if Paul came into contact with variant Greek versions of Isaiah that offered him some scope to match the text to his arguments. So it's not just that one instance in 1 Corinthians 15, but perhaps more widely. Even if he didn't pick them up, they may have been available to him. Apart from the quotation of Isaiah 25, then, where else might we look for alternative Greek versions of Isaiah in the 1st century CE, given that we don't have any more Dead Sea Scrolls at the moment? So our critical editions of the Septuagint depend on Christian uncial manuscripts of the 4th, 5th and 6th century of the Common Era, so Christian, for reconstructing the original Alexandrian Jewish translations of the Old Greek that had been made 500 or 600 years earlier. I personally don't believe that these could be identical to what left the hands of the translator, but of course when creating a critical edition, editors have to work with the materials that they have, which are in main these complete manuscripts from a very much later date. Seligman was aware that there probably had been editorial changes and revisions, but we can't prove them very easily. Even before these important manuscripts were written in the early 3rd century, the Christian scholar Origen tried to sort out what had become a very corrupt situation in the Church's Old Testament scripture texts. And he did this using techniques copied from classical text criticism. Now, Origen assumed, wrongly as it turns out, that the most reliable Greek manuscripts were those that best matched the Hebrew text of his own day. So he hadn't realized that the Hebrew itself had moved on. And he also used the versions of the Greek revisers Aquila, Symmachus and Theodotion because his Hebrew wasn't all that good. So for Origen's own edition, his own scholarly edition of the Greek Old Testament, he often appears to work from texts that had already been revised away from the looser Old Greek renderings that had been in circulation. He chose, without realizing it, sort of pro-Hebrew, pro-Hebraizing texts. And those readings that he put into his text then crept into Christian tradition. Some of them can be found in the apparatus of the critical editions today. The editors have sometimes noticed that these are Hebraizing editions or changes and have put them in the main apparatus. When we're using scholarly editions and thinking about what's happening in, say, the 1st century of the Common Era, the scholarly edition is not very helpful because what a Jew or a Christian in the 1st century of the Common Era will probably be using a very, very mixed text, which would have, if it was a bad text, a lot of corruptions and stylistic changes. If it was a good text, perhaps it had some kind of revision towards the Hebrew. So not at all like our critical texts. Though these sorts of revisional texts could in theory have been created anywhere where a bilingual scribe could work, and provided he had a pen and ink and some kind of scroll that he could work from, I think on the whole Palestine seems the most obvious place for that type of activity, and that of course is suggested and supported by the existence of the Minor Prophet scroll from Nachal Hever. What form would such a Hebraizing revision of Greek Isaiah take? As an example, I made my own reconstruction on the handout, and maybe on here in a minute, of what a possible early revision of Isaiah could look like. And I have to say this is my reconstruction, and I'm sure people would have a lot of issues with what I've done. Now, I've got 66 chapters to choose from. Which one should I choose? I chose not to go for something theologically loaded like 52, 53, or even 5, which is quoted in the Gospels or alluded to in the Gospels. So what I did, I picked the first half of chapter 60, which for many Western churches is today's reading for the Feast of the Epiphany. It marks the arrival of the Magi in Bethlehem to see the infant Jesus. And there is a very indirect allusion in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 2, to this passage, which is why it's effectively the kind of haftarah for this particular festival, because of the gold and frankincense that get mentioned in Matthew, and it's in this text here in verse 6, I think. The idea of kings and camels, interestingly, came in at a later date from this very reading back into Christian tradition, so it's a two-way street. So the revised text that I came up with is based on pro-Hebrew readings from manuscripts of Isaiah that were influenced by Origen's textual work. Usually these variants are really very minor. They involve changing the word order of the Old Greek to completely match that of the Hebrew, or there are things like personal pronouns added, mu, su, auton, that kind of thing. As a secondary step, I included readings that may derive from the revision known as Theodotion, and on the basis of Barthelme's work, Theodotion may not have been a late 2nd century CE reviser, but a much earlier reviser, perhaps early Common Era. So I put in anything from him, and you'll see on the Greek is marked up rather heavily, so you can see roughly where things come from, and you could refer back to Ziegler's edition if you wanted to. For instance, generally there aren't too many big changes, but at the end of verse 8, there's a correction of a guesswork translation in the Old Greek. The Old Greek didn't understand, apparently, the Hebrew el arubotehem, and translated it with their chicks, because he was talking about doves, so he thought, well, I'm not sure what this is. I think it must do something to do with chicks. We get a lot of chicks in Leviticus, so here we are. But in so-called Theodotion seems to know what this word means. He says, to their windows. And that's much more accurate and probably derives from a comparison of the passage with Genesis, where this comes up in Noah's Ark. One of Theodotion's odder techniques, which was written about by Emmanuel Tove some years ago, is the transliteration of names or terms that were not well understood. So in verse 13, we have 3 types of tree. The Old Greek has had a guess at what those trees must be, and so they are translated in the Old Greek version. What Theodotion seems to have thought, or the school of revisers known as Theodotion seems to have thought, not sure about that. I don't think those are accurate translations, but because I don't know what they are, I will transliterate them. And when somebody comes up in another generation and can identify these trees accurately, then they will actually translate these words properly. And that's what Emmanuel Tove thinks, and it seems very plausible. So we have a kind of non-translation in verse 13. Another strange feature in verse 9 and verse 1, Origen tells us that in the best Hebrew texts of his day, the divine name was represented in square Hebrew characters in some Greek revised texts. And that's confirmed by what we find in some Dead Sea Scrolls as well, in both Hebrew and Greek. Unfortunately, you have the phenomenon of poorly educated Greek scribes who can't read Hebrew. They misread the divine name in square script as the Greek letters pi iota. And then this gets perpetuated in the Greek manuscript tradition and then into Syriac. And in the late 7th century, the Syrian Orthodox Bishop Jacob of Edessa realized what had happened because this strange, very bizarre name was occurring in so many manuscripts, and he tried to stamp out this idea that the sacred name of God was spelt Pei-Yud. He condemns this misconception as satanic, and he goes on for a number of pages about how totally wrong it is and why it happened. But anyway, at least in this revised text, the Christian witnesses seem to suggest that Theodotion or some other earlier revision put in the Hebrew tetragrammaton rather than the Greek kurios. All in all, the Old Greek translation of chapter 60 is not too far from what we would understand the meaning of the Masoretic text to be, and yet this older layer of translation is not close. In contrast, the adjustments towards the Hebrew in semi-revised texts, along with those renderings of Theodotion, do make a noticeable difference to the wording of the Greek text. That's why you probably can't see it very well on the slide, but maybe on the handout I've put in bold type all the actual changes against what we have called the Old Greek. Something like verse 13, the place of my feet I shall glorify, I think is not in the Old Greek at all. I should stress again that this is purely my hypothetical reconstruction of what a text may have looked like that had been semi-revised towards the Hebrew in the first century, so around in the time of St. Paul. No single text exists at present that looks exactly like that. And yet, because of Nachal Hever and the Minor Prophet Scroll, I think it's legitimate at least to think about what sorts of revisions might have been taking place. So to conclude, time doesn't permit further discussion of how the various forms of Isaiah were understood by the Qumran community and the writers of the New Testament. But skipping forward nearly 2,000 years, you have on the handout and up here a reproduction that's actually appeared in the new Oxford Centre for Hebrew and Jewish Studies downstairs by the library, something that intrigued me a great deal. This is a poster from 1942 Mandate Palestine, I think, that shows how Isaiah continued to be interpreted right up to the finding of the Great Isaiah Scroll. In this case, the exegetes are modern advertising media. The citation from Isaiah 52, verse 1, was used to encourage Jewish women to join the auxiliary territorial services during the Second World War. This is wonderful because the second-person feminine imperative, live she, which of course is addressed to Jerusalem in the original text, is spoken directly to any female reader. You can't do this in English or Greek. Any female reader who looks at that poster is directly addressed by the wording from the Bible and from the poster. The rather drab uniform that she's holding out here is your garments of glory, your glorious garments. It may be just a khaki uniform, but it's glorious. Just as in much earlier exegesis, the wider original context of this citation is completely ignored, and the original addressee, for the sake of exploiting what seems a perfect match of citation to contemporary situation. It could be objected, of course, that advertisers are not exegetes, but given the contemporary situation of the war in Mandate Palestine, the eschatological nuances were surely not lost on the poster's author. The title of an article by David Bayer on Old Greek Isaiah sums up a common attitude towards the book among the groups of the Second Temple period and also beyond. His title was, "It's All About Us." This title neatly expresses many readers' excitement in finding the message of the book of Isaiah to be relevant to their own community from all the way back at the Babylonian exile up to the present day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. We have a couple of minutes for questions and comments before we go out for a coffee break. So, any question or comment? Yes, please.
Thank you. It's really fascinating. My question is, do you see any kind of unified ideological tendency in this hypothetical reconstruction? Because this is really a fascinating chapter in its kind of inner tension or even indecisiveness in the way it treats the nations. On the one hand, they're led as captives to serve Jerusalem or Zion. On the other hand, there's a kind of a voluntary tone here about who will left, or so do you see any differences in this context?
In the revision?
Yes.
I think at the time I wasn't looking for anything because I thought it might interfere with my reconstruction. I was trying to do it just on the basis of literally what was in the apparatus, the first and second apparatus, and just using those strict limits and not thinking about what the result really meant. I think I'd have to look at it again, but it's quite possible, actually. Yes, I think that is very possible. But also interesting because in light of the way that it's influenced Matthew with, whether we've got Magoi, not kings there in the original. The idea of the kings comes in later, but of course that goes against the captive kings here. I need to look at it again, but thank you very much. It's a very good point.
And in a way, his paper in a few minutes will continue.
Great.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. One question. Would you assume that the division is located in Eretz Israel? And if so, what would that mean for Paul's intellectual and traditional background?
Well, I mean, the scripture text of Paul, whether he had testimonia and that kind of thing, is still very debated, isn't it? I like to think it was in Eretz Israel. I think that makes the most sense. I think that's where a movement of revision would have started. But of course, people move around, texts move around. There's no reason why somebody who was perhaps originally trained in Israel couldn't go out to Antioch or further north or Greece or whatever, and provided he has a scroll of the Old Greek and something similar to the Old Greek and a Hebrew scroll. There's no reason why he couldn't work anywhere and disseminate his work, or a scroll could be made in Palestine and then taken somewhere else from there. So people moved around a lot. So I'd like to think of the revision, the impetus for revision starting back in Rome and Palestine, but then after that it could be anywhere. But did they not? I mean, the fact that we have so many variants does suggest there was a lot of correction going on. I mean, or do we know that what we have in the scholarly edition is the first translation? I'm not sure at all. I can't think that 500 years went by and nothing changed. But I mean, this is a methodological problem with working with biblical texts, really. So.